My name is Michael Mackenzie, and I'm interested in the challenges and possibilities of making long-term decisions in democratic systems. We've done poorly managing many long-term issues such as climate change, public debt, natural disaster preparedness, nuclear waste disposal, and plastics pollution, just to mention a few. Is democracy part of the problem, or is it part of the solution? Many people worry that democratic systems are inherently myopic, that they have features that make them structurally short-sighted. And people have identified at least 4 arguments to support this claim, which I call the democratic myopia thesis. The first argument has to do with myopic voters. If voters care more about the near term and less about the future, elected politicians are likely to do the same. The second argument has to do with short electoral cycles. Now, these 2 arguments are often conflated, but they are in fact conceptually distinct. Politicians have strong incentives not to invest in long-term plans, projects, and initiatives, because they know in a democratic system, future governments can undo those long-term plans and initiatives. The third argument makes an ontological observation. Future generations will be affected by our collective decisions, but they cannot be included in our collective decision-making processes because they don't yet exist. Now, this is a problem for all political systems, but it's a particular problem for democratic systems because democracies are predicated on the all-affected interest principle. According to this principle, all those who are affected by collective decisions should have some meaningful role in making those decisions. But if future generations can't be included, their interests are likely to be ignored or undervalued in our democratic decision-making processes. The fourth argument has to do with democratic capture. If there are groups within society who have dominant short-term interests that they wish to pursue at the expense of the longer-term interests of society as a whole, they may be able to do so if they capture the democratic process. The most common version of this argument has to do with the influence of wealthy actors, individuals and corporations, for example. Most democratic systems have, in fact, been captured by wealthy economic elites. Now, these 4 arguments are predicated on different assumptions. They are, however, often presented as a single set of arguments in defense of the democratic myopia thesis. But the first 2 arguments are predicated on an assumption that democracy will be short-sighted when it's working well, which is to say, when democracies are sufficiently responsive to the demands of voters, and when elected politicians can be replaced by new ones. The second 2 arguments are predicated on an assumption that democracy will be short-sighted when it's working poorly, that is, when it's insufficiently inclusive, or when it's insufficiently responsive to the demands of affected publics. Now, the democratic myopia thesis has led some to believe that we should have more authoritarian governments if we want to make our political systems more future-regarding. They argue that we need governments with the power and the capacity to impose near-term costs on unwilling publics for their own future potential benefit. Now, I'm more interested in democratic solutions to the democratic myopia problem. How can we make our democratic systems more future-regarding while also making them more democratic? Now, I think that sortition or random selection may be part of the solution. Imagine a political system with 2 legislative chambers. One is an elected chamber, and the other is a sortition chamber. The second chamber would be populated by people who are randomly selected from the population as a whole. They'd be paid like other politicians, and they'd sit for some limited period of time, probably 1 or 2 years. And the sortition chamber would be empowered to review law proposals coming from the elected chamber. They'd assess them, they'd approve them, they'd recommend amendments, or they would reject them. But I think that the sortition chamber should also be empowered to initiate its own law proposals, which would then be taken up by the elected chamber. Now here's the catch. I think that the sortition chamber should be given an explicit mandate to act as a representative of future generations. There are several reasons why I think a sortition legislature is well positioned to perform this role in our democratic systems. First, it would be inclusive. Indeed, sortition chambers are generally more inclusive, that is to say, more representative of all the different types of people in our society than our elected legislatures. Inclusion matters because when we're thinking about making long-term decisions, we have to make decisions on a whole bunch of different kinds of issues. I mentioned some in the introduction: climate change, nuclear waste disposal, plastics pollution. But every issue that we're making, every decision that we're making will have longer-term consequences. And when we're making those decisions, we have to think about how those decisions are going to affect different types of people within current publics, but also how they're going to affect diverse future publics. And the best way to do that is to have an inclusive legislature that includes very many different types of people. Secondly, a randomly selected legislature would be deliberative. Research has shown that other randomly selected assemblies are highly deliberative. Now, this matters because our biases against the future are located in the intuitive parts of our brains, which is to say that we tend to be biased against the future when we're not thinking carefully enough. But deliberation forces us to use the analytical parts of our brains. When we're in an effective deliberative environment, we have to think about the arguments we're making, we have to listen to the arguments that others make, and we have to construct our arguments or make proposals that we think other people might plausibly accept. Now, these are cognitively demanding tasks. And a randomly selected legislature would be a deliberative legislature. And the expectation is that when people are selected to serve on the legislature, they would be myopic. But they wouldn't be myopic after they started talking to each other. Now, thirdly, the legislature would be independent in two important ways. First, it could operate independently from the political dynamics of short electoral cycles. Secondly, the members of the legislature would not be captured by wealthy interests. They wouldn't owe their position to the money that the wealthy interests gave them for their election campaigns, because they wouldn't have election campaigns. They would owe their position only to the luck of the draw. And that's what would make them independent. And then lastly, the legislature would be empowered in all the ways I've just mentioned. They'd be able to review and amend and reject law proposals coming from the elected assembly, but they'd also be able to initiate their own future regarding law proposals. We don't have any other institutions in our political systems, in our democratic systems, that are explicitly mandated to represent the potential interests of future others and given the power to do so. We cannot continue to fail future others. We cannot continue to ignore and undervalue their interests. There are democratic solutions to the democratic myopia problem. Randomly selected legislatures at the local, regional, national, and even international levels would help ensure that the interests of future others are not ignored in our collective decision-making processes today.